Australia began as a British penal colony 230 years ago. So let's get right into it. It's no longer a well-hidden fact, nor even an embarrassment, that Australia was originally founded as the Botany Bay Penal Colony in the late 18th century. But how exactly did an entire continent come to be settled by British convicts? Botany Bay is an inlet on the eastern coast of Australia, just south of Sydney. In 1770, the bay was discovered by the famous British explorer Captain James Cook in his ship the HMS Endeavour. It was named Botany Bay because of the abundance of plant life noticed by the ship's naturalist, Sir Joseph Banks. A decade later, recently deprived of its American colonies, Britain was desperate to find another territory to ship its prisoners to. At the time, criminals were considered defective, couldn't be rehabilitated, and must in fact be separated from its law-abiding citizens. So prisoners had to be either executed or exiled. Australia seemed to fit the bill, as it was inhabited by only native Aborigines, and no other European power had established a colony there. So on Captain Cook's report, Botany Bay was selected by Britain. The first fleet of 11 ships, filled with 736 convicts, set sail from England in 1787. They sailed for 8 long months around Africa's Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. Captain Arthur Phillip, a tough but fair naval officer, was in charge of the fleet and was setting up the first penal colony in Australia. The 736 convicts were chained beneath the decks for the entire hellish voyage. While the journey claimed only 36 prisoners, later trips would see up to a third die along the way. Interestingly, only a small minority were hardened criminals convicted of violent crimes. Women made up 15% of the convict population. Those ships carrying females inevitably became floating brothels. The poor women were exposed to unspeakable degradation, with younger women lined up for inspection. The prettiest were taken to the officers' cabins, while the others were thrown in with the crew. Discipline aboard the ships was brutal, with the crew themselves often cruel drunks recruited from dockside taverns. Most were thugs who didn't shrink from doling out the most brutal punishment on any convict who dared break a rule. Dysentery, scurvy, and seasickness were also rife, making conditions below deck most foul. The fleet of ships finally sailed into Botany Bay in January of 1788. Upon inspection, though, the large bay was deemed uninhabitable due to lack of fresh water and extremely marshy soil. Captain Phillip's shock and disappointment must have been palatable. This is where they sent him? What was he to do now, with 6 ships full of convicts? Based on Cook's records, they took the fleet 9 miles up the coast, landing at Port Jackson in Sydney Cove 6 days later. Here all worries vanished, as Phillip had just discovered one of the finest harbors in the world. The night the male convicts landed, January 26, 1788, the Union Jack was hoisted, a succession of volleys fired from the ships, and many toasts of rum were drunk. Captain Phillips led his officers in 3 cheers of "Huzzah!" Australia Day commemorates this first landing of white settlers on the continent. For the convicts who disembarked in Sydney Cove, that first Australia Day, it was a bit bewildering. Unused to land after 8 months below deck, they stumbled through the cove's alien forest. It was 2 weeks before enough huts could be built for the female convicts to leave the ships. In the midst of a storm, they held the first Australian bush party, dancing, singing, and drinking into the night. Though no longer confined behind bars, the convicts still had an extremely rough life. The guards who signed up for duty in Australia were driven by cruelty bordering on sadism. Governor Phillip was strict, but even small violations could result in 50 lashes with a cat-o'-nine-tails whip. Blood was usually drawn after the 5th strike, so the conditions of their backs after 50 was more like raw meat. The female convicts were often reported as low-class, foul-mouthed women with loose morals. But women in those days were often imprisoned as punishment for simply misbehaving towards a man or having illegitimate children. At Sydney Cove, they were forced to perform the more menial tasks like sewing clothing or toiling over washtubs. Punishment for women was not the whip, but rather having their heads shaved as a mark of disgrace to all. So who exactly were all these convicts forced to the land down under? They were prisoners, yes, but only a small fraction were dangerous murderers. Most were common poachers or thieves, while others were political or religious prisoners, radical Luddites, Catholic ribbonmen, or Scottish Jacobites. Regardless, all were treated the same by Captain Phillip. Those early days were perilous as their food stocks dwindled and rations were frequently cut. It was only after the arrival of supply ships that enabled the colony to avoid complete starvation. Two more fleets arrived in what was now called New South Wales in 1790 and 1791. Now called transportees rather than convicts, the average age was about 26, and on these trips included children. They now included immigrants and their families, attracted to dreams of a better life than in merry old England. And it was not just the poor who headed down under. Australia became a place where Britain sent unacceptable members of all its classes, including the gentry. It was an ideal place to send a young man who had gambling debts, or who hadn't particularly been good academically, or maybe had gotten the family maid pregnant. The famous author Charles Dickens sent two of his sons to Australia. Whether they arrived as convicts or immigrants, the settlers faced a forbidding, unwelcoming landscape. In a continent with little water and poor soil, growing crops proved extremely difficult. The western interior, or outback as it came to be called, offered no great river, and many yeomen who ventured there perished in the desert heat. Nevertheless, in the end, they stayed and endured. The emigrants traveled out beyond colonial control and squatted on huge tracts of land. While farming was a bit hit or miss, the settlers soon realized that the Australian climate was perfect for sheep. The animals would become a mainstay of the Australian economy. As settlements expanded, they came into conflict with the native Aborigines who had lived there for thousands of years. Captain Phillip ordered that they must be treated well, and anyone killing an Aborigine would be hanged. The natives considered this their continent, so they began killing the settlers' livestock, and sometimes the settlers themselves. This is when the guns came out and British firepower ultimately won. Frontier wars, massacres, and the introduction of European diseases devastated the Aborigine population. In 1851, gold was discovered in New South Wales, sparking a gold rush similar to California's. Melbourne went from a tiny fishing village to one of the greatest cities of the empire in just 20 years. Gold brought wealth to the continent and hastened an influx of even more migrants. The gold rush also sparked the beginning of the end of convict transportees, due to a growing resentment from the new established population. Over the next 80 years from that first fleet, more than 160,000 convicts were transported to Australia from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. After 1868, when the convict transferees ended, Australians tried to hide their founders' legacy, considering it a disgrace and an embarrassment. But over the centuries, Australia's shame has been transformed into national pride. The truth about who the convicts really were has helped remove the stigma. Some were just kids. Some did little more than steal a bag of flour. Some were just political or religious prisoners. Today, about 20% of Australians are descended from those founding convicts. Some many of its most prominent citizens, including even former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd.